we'll just give it one more minute, Jill.
Okay, thanks, Hannah. I'm ready when you are.
Yeah, if you want to make a start when you're ready, Jamie's clicked record, so.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I trust you're there. I can't see you, but it's lovely to be presenting to you today. My name is Jill Newman, and I'm one of the chaplains here at Princess Alexandra Hospital. So one of the few certainties that there are in life is that one day we are going to die. And yet, despite this, we can be very reluctant to talk about death, which is why once a year, Dying Matters Awareness Week encourages people to start having the conversations that we're normally very reluctant to have. So today, in this briefing, what I'd like to do is to consider first what we might mean by a good death, and then to think about the importance of spiritual care at the end of life, and then to talk about the role of the chaplaincy team and the support that we can offer to patients and their families when somebody is approaching the end of life. A good death. I wonder what that might mean for you, and whether you've even ever thought about death as to whether it can be described as a good death. Maybe you can think of patients that you've cared for, patients who, in your opinion, you would say died well, and perhaps those who didn't. If you could choose how you died, what would it look like? How would you want it to be? I wonder if you've ever asked yourself that question. Dying well is not only important for the one who is dying, but also for those who love them and who are going to be affected by their death. The point is that many today, dying suddenly, maybe while they're asleep without any warning, just to slip away quietly, is part of what might be considered a good death. But for many hundreds of years in the past, to die unexpectedly would have been the worst possible way to die. How terrible to be catapulted into eternity without any chance to prepare yourself to meet your maker, to ask for forgiveness, to say goodbye to loved ones, to find peace. We need to bear in mind that there's no one answer to what a good death looks like. It's going to differ according to the cultures that we are part of and the beliefs that we hold. But I do think it's important to remember that for many people, if not most people, yes, death is a physical event, of course, but it's also a spiritual event, because I believe we are all not only physical beings, but spiritual beings as well. So what do I mean by that, by the fact that we are spiritual beings? What I don't mean, but perhaps it's easier to say, is that we all have a religious belief. There are many people for who express their spirituality through their religious beliefs, and for some people, their religious beliefs are inseparable from their spirituality, and it's vital to respect that. But when I say that as human beings, I think we're all spiritual beings, what I'm meaning or referring to is the universal need that we all have as human beings for meaning, for purpose, for hope, and to be in relationship. And that by relationship, I'm thinking about relationship not only with other people, but relationship with God, or what we consider to be the transcendent, a greater power than ourselves, and relationship with ourselves as well. Because if we can see a meaning, if we have meaning in our lives, if we've got a purpose to live for, if we have hope to look forward to, and if we have good relationships, that can help us bear things in life which might otherwise be quite unbearable. So meaning, purpose, inner strength, hope, and relationship. This, in my mind, is the realm of the human spirit and spirituality. So death, a physical event, yes, but also a spiritual event. Because depending on what our beliefs are, death and the prospect of death can threaten to bring to an end all those things in which we have found meaning, hope, strength, and purpose in life, not least in our relationships with others. And most fundamentally, death can face us with the most basic existential human fear of all, the fear of extinction, of ceasing to be. How do we get our minds round that one? And because of that, that's why many people wish to leave some kind of legacy behind them that enables them to live on in the memory of others. Maybe they will see their legacy as being in their children or their grandchildren, in an inheritance they can pass on, a house, a business or a charity that they've set up, a book that they've written. Evidence not only that they really existed, but that their life had meaning. A few weeks ago, I visited a patient on one of our wards who knew she was dying of cancer and didn't have very long ahead to live. And I listened to her for well over an hour, and she basically told me her life story from beginning to end. She didn't need me to say very much or to ask very much. What she needed was someone to listen as she played back to herself all the things that had given meaning to her life. So, death, I firmly believe, is not only a physical event, but a spiritual event too, because it challenges us about the meaning of our life, what its purpose has been, whether I will continue to exist in some way after my body dies, how to let go of those that I love, how I find peace. Nurse, what happens when we die? What happens when I die? I wonder if anybody has asked you that question, or whether you've asked it of yourself. Some of us may believe we have a soul that will live on after our body dies. Others of us won't. Some of us may believe that how we've lived in this life will have consequences for a life after death. Others of us may believe there is nothing beyond death, that death is the end. Some of us may regard death as an enemy to be fought against by every possible medical treatment and even spiritual healing. Others of us may believe death is a natural part of life and should be accepted and made as peaceful an experience as possible. I remember talking to a patient who knew he didn't have much longer to live, and he told me that he wasn't at all afraid to die because years ago, after a severe stroke, he had had a really vivid near to death experience. He had felt himself moving towards a place of immense beauty and light and peace. And he'd even glimpsed his late father almost beckoning to him. And it had convinced him that there was a heaven, a beautiful heaven, and that he'd never been scared of dying since. Our beliefs about death then will be different. They will be shaped by our culture, our religion, and our experiences. But they matter and they are important because they will determine whether or not we find a meaning in our death, how we prepare ourselves for it, and how we wish to be cared for at the end of life. For example, if someone believes strongly that after death they will be reunited with a loved one in heaven, that can be a very important source of hope and comfort, which helps them to find meaning in death. Alternatively, If someone strongly believes that the state of their mind and soul at the point of death will play a part in determining their next life, it may be very important that their final hours are as peaceful as possible, or that the right words or prayers are said. And whatever our own beliefs about death are, I think it's important for each of us as healthcare professionals working with very ill and dying patients to consider in advance how we would respond to a question like this. So that if we are asked, what happens when I die? We can respond thoughtfully in a way that will have integrity and yet will not impose our own personal beliefs on a vulnerable person. So, a little bit about spiritual care at the end of life, what that might look like. And I want to suggest that there's a sense in which, as human beings, we're all a little bit like onions because we have different layers to us. Um, Normally, people around us get to see the outer layers. But for most of us, we have inner layers, layers that we keep hidden from others. Um, Usually, we will choose which layers that we reveal to which people, depending on how much we trust them or how close we are to them. But most of us have layers that we keep hidden, things which we don't want others to know, maybe things we don't like about ourselves, things we feel ashamed of, maybe that we've done in the past. The problem is that these inner layers, which we choose to keep to ourselves, can often be the things which gnaw away within us, and they can take away our inner peace. And I want to suggest that death is maybe, or the time when we're approaching death and the end of our lives, is a time for taking an honest look at these hidden layers. A few moments ago, I mentioned a patient who'd had a near to death experience. A bit later in the same conversation, that same patient confided in me about an incident that had happened, which made him feel he'd let his father down badly. He'd basically been put in a situation where he'd broken a promise that he had made to his father before his father's death, and he had never been able to forgive himself for that. So, although he wasn't afraid of dying, he admitted that he was actually very anxious about meeting his father again in heaven. There was another patient whom I met in our A&E department. He'd been admitted in the end stages of cancer, with his symptoms getting much worse. But the one thing that he really wanted to tell me about was not about his symptoms or about his cancer. It was about how he and his son had become estranged years ago, and the pain, what you might call the spiritual pain of that estrangement, and how he desperately wanted to meet him one last time before he died to tell him he loved him. One of the hidden layers in the onion. There was another patient again. This was a lady I'd been called to pray for as she approached the end of her life. And she had been hanging on. She'd been barely conscious, but she seemed to have been hanging on for several days. And her niece was with her. This patient had always gone to church, and the niece asked if I could pray with her. So I prayed for her, and just at the end of my prayers, literally, her breathing changed and she died peacefully a few minutes later, with us both sitting next to her. When bereaved families talk about the death of their loved one of the things which comforts them and helps to make the death more bearable is if he or she seemed peaceful at the time of death. And for myself, having inner peace, I think, is at the heart of what I would describe as being a good death. Peace with oneself, peace with others, and peace with God. Physically, being free of pain is undoubtedly a crucial aspect of being at peace for someone who's dying. But I hope, as the stories I've just mentioned show, some of our patients have deep spiritual or emotional pain, which also needs to be attended to if they are to find inner peace before they die. And this is where we as chaplains may be able to offer some support. Not because we've got all the answers, but I think partly because we are comfortable with the asking of the questions. I mentioned that the analogy of being onions with hidden layers, that death is maybe the time for bringing to light, so that any issues there that are gnawing away at us can be dealt with in order to find peace. And I want to think next a little bit about what the hidden layers of the onion can be that we as chaplains may be able to assist with in order to help somebody find inner peace. And the first one that I really want to talk about is forgiveness and finding forgiveness. I think forgiveness, in my experience, is one of the most frequent issues that people who are dying talk about. Some people will recount unjust and even abusive treatment they've suffered at the hands of others in their lives, which they have never been able to forget or forgive. They've hidden it down. Others, just like the patient who felt that he'd let his father down so badly, talk about things they did themselves, which they have never been able to forgive themselves for. It's not a light or an easy thing to forgive others when we've been deeply hurt, or to forgive ourselves if we know we have deeply hurt others. People may carry such events and the feelings of pain and guilt and shame attached to them across a lifetime. And sometimes, even just to talk about what happened and how it's made them feel can bring enormous relief. Thank you for listening. I feel so much better is something that we as chaplains, people say to us a lot. So sometimes even just to talk about what has happened can be the trigger that enables some of these hidden layers to come to the surface, be recognised and dealt with. At other times, maybe a simple ritual or a symbolic action, such as being anointed and as a sign of forgiveness, can also be very helpful. To be able to let go of bitterness or resentment towards someone and finally forgive, or to accept that you yourself are forgiven and to be released from guilt, brings immense inner peace. I've talked already about the patient who was very anxious about meeting his father in heaven. And a little later on in that conversation, it was quite a long conversation, we talked about this, and I was able to remind him that when he'd had his near-death experience many years previously, he had seen his father. And I asked the patient how his father had seemed then, as the patient had had this glimpse of what he perceived to be heaven. He'd seen his father in heaven. He hadn't himself felt that it was the right time for go, and he hadn't died that time. He had been he had lived for many subsequent years. But I reminded him he'd seen this glimpse of his father, and how had he appeared? Had his father appeared angry? And the patient thought back and he said, no, not at all. He seemed really pleased to see me. And so I said, well, I suggest that if he was really pleased to see you, your father has forgiven you. And that was enough. Just by telling his story to someone else, he was able to make a connection that he hadn't made before. He'd been carrying this anxiety about meeting his father. It had been depriving him of the peace that he otherwise felt about dying. And just to remember back, thought, oh, actually, when I glimpsed my father, he didn't seem angry with me. And that brought him huge relief. Finding forgiveness. It's one of the spiritual tasks that can help somebody die at peace with themselves and at peace with others. But for many of our patients, being at peace with God when they die is also crucially important. I think it can be hard for those of us who don't have a religious faith ourselves to appreciate just how important faith in God can be for those who do believe. I think earlier I mentioned the patient who died just moments after I had prayed for her, and this is by no means unusual. When somebody has a strong religious belief, it can impact on every area of their life and be a crucial source of hope and meaning. And at the time of death, it may be incredibly important for that person to feel they are ready to meet God. Prayer, anointing, readings from religious texts and other rituals, which will differ, of course, according to the person's religious tradition, can play a very important part in helping that person feel at peace with God and ready to let go of this life. Sadly, I think here at PAH, we're not always very good at identifying our patients' religious needs. And there can be a reluctance on the part of some staff to ask patients and families whether they do hold any religious beliefs, or perhaps they don't consider it themselves because it's not particularly important to themselves as people. They forget that it might be important to somebody else. Consequently, for us as chaplains, we often either get called too late to try and address any of the spiritual and religious needs a patient may have, or sometimes we're not called at all. So I'd like to take this opportunity, please, to encourage any staff on the call who do care for patients approaching the end of life, just to consider using the Hope Assessment tool, which is printed in the End of Life, the individual care pathway for the end of life, which is there to help you in identifying spiritual religious needs. And I just want to quickly talk through the different parts of this now. So HOPE is an acronym, and it's an aid memoir for you to think about different areas that you might want to try and find out about your patient who is approaching the end of life. H stands for hope. Where does this person find hope, purpose, strength, and peace? O stands for organised religion. Do they consider themselves to be part of an organised religious tradition? P stands for practices or personally. They may or may not be part of an organised religion, but they may also have particular spiritual or religious practices that are important to them personally. For example, the practice of meditation or mindfulness. And lastly, E, the effects. If they do have those beliefs and practices, what are the effects of these for how they would like to be cared for and treated at the end of life? So HOPE, an acronym, an aid memoir. Do consider those questions to help you try and assess whether it's going to be appropriate, whether your patient has spiritual or religious needs, and whether it might be appropriate to call a chaplain. So that's the patient, and we're coming very near to the end now. Just want to remind you also that as chaplains, we can offer support not only to the patient who is nearing the end of life, but to their family as well. Dame Cicely Saunders famously said, "How people die remains in the memory of those who live on." And I think for any of us on this briefing who have had close friends or relations who have died, you will know the truth of that. So as chaplains, we offer to support not only to the patients near the end of life, but to their families as well. Sometimes the conversations we've had have resulted in requests to conduct a funeral too. So what support can we give families? We can provide emotional support. We can be there to listen. We can provide services of naming and blessing for babies at the end of life. We can accompany families on visits to the mortuary if that's what is necessary. We can conduct funerals if we are asked. And we also offer bereavement support with follow-up phone calls or on the ward themselves. Over the past 12 months as a chaplaincy team, we've made over 60 phone calls to bereaved families, offering emotional support and frequently signposting them to other organisations that might be of help. So do consider the chaplaincy service if we can support any of your families as well. Finally, I've talked about what a good death might be like, about finding peace, about how chaplains might help patients and provide support to families. But I just like to finish with this, which I think is the golden rule. And it's basically to remember that each one of our patients is an individual person. And we can't afford to make any assumptions. We can't afford to assume that this person either does have spiritual or religious needs or doesn't have. And we need to remember that spiritual and religious needs can change as well. So please don't make assumptions. Ask either the patient or the family to find out if somebody does have spiritual and religious needs as they approach the end of life. And please do contact us as chaplains if we can provide support. Right. Thank you very much. I'll just see if I can stop sharing my screen. You can see that I'm a real person behind the PowerPoint. I am actually here in person. It's not just a recording. I think we're coming up to the end of our time and I haven't left very much time for questions, but is there any quick question that anybody just wants to raise just before we finish? Okay, if something comes to mind, oh yes, hi, Melanie, I can see your hand up. Go ahead, unmute yourself. Is Melanie there? Melanie,
Yes,
you're
I am here.
Hi.
I am here. Oh, it wasn't actually a question, Jill. I just wanted to thank you very much. I found that really helpful and quite inspiring. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much, Melanie. Thank you. That's great. Well, Christian and I and other our chaplaincy volunteers are always around. So if anything else comes to mind or you want to contact us separately, we'd always be very happy to talk to you. But I'll just finish by thanking you for tuning in to this briefing. Thank you. Hannah, do I hand over to you, Jamie?
Yeah, you're all ended, so I'll stop recording now. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much.
Jill.
Oh, thank you. Oh, Getch, you've got your hand up.
No, I was just going to echo what lady said before that, which is a big thank you, and I've put it in the chat box, which is thank you for going through what support you provide for people of all faiths and those of no faith at all. And I like the way that it was capturated around spiritual support. So thank you.
Thanks, Getch. Thank you very much. Okay, everybody, go well into the rest of your day. Nice to see you today. Bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.